Well, it's now 3 months since lockdown began. Whether you're a child who's missing school, missing friends or grandparents, whether you're a parent who's worn out from trying to juggle work, housework, homeschooling, whether you're a grandparent who's lonely, missing their grandchildren, missing their children or friends, whether you're perhaps one of those or not, perhaps you're a vulnerable person who's feeling isolated. I think most of us here will feel weary or burdened in some way, physically, mentally, both, exhausted. And when you heard this passage today read, "Come to me, all you who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest," you may have thought, great, this is just the passage for me today. If that is you, you're right, but for reasons deeper than you might imagine. This is a passage about, amongst other things, rest for the soul. Rest for the soul. We're going to ask 3 questions today in relation to rest that Jesus offers. And here they are. The 3 questions are: who is the rest on offer to? What is the rest like? And then how do I get it? So firstly, who is the rest on offer to? Well, Jesus says in verse 28, if you have your Bibles open, "Come to me all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." But is this rest just for people who are feeling, as the NIV puts it, weary and burdened? I think it helps to consider what it is that is making people heavy laden or weighed down. In verse 1 of chapter 11, we see that Jesus is out preaching in towns in Galilee to crowds who are coming to hear him speak. And the context of what life was like for those people is helpful. I'm going to share a passage a bit later on in the book of Matthew with you now. This is in Matthew chapter 23. And it says this: "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, 'The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe what they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice.' And then, importantly, they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger." The teachers of the law were placing heavy, crushing burdens on the people. It was a religious society in those days, and the teachers of the law had great authority in society. Generally, we see when heavy loads are placed on people and those in authority do nothing to ease those burdens, it leads to weariness. You could imagine that those people may have felt things like, "I'm not moral enough, I'm not religious enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not sticking to the rules well enough." And we see in the Gospels how the teachers of the law responded when people strayed from these commandments. They came down on them harshly. It was at times quite an oppressive society. But in our day, let's just have a think about what imposer of regulations might be weighing us down today. Perhaps it's your teacher at school or at college. Perhaps it's your boss at work. Perhaps it's even a family member. Perhaps it's the standards you set for yourself. Perhaps it's society at large. Jesus doesn't specify in this passage exactly what burdens he refers to. He simply says, "All you who are weary and burdened." Therefore, I think we can throw the net wider. Some of you may have heard or may not have heard of a Roman poet called Horace. He once said this: "No one lives content with his condition, whether reason gave it to him or chance threw it away. No one lives content with his condition, whether reason gave it to him or chance threw it his way." And I can empathize with that. I think part of our human condition seems to be that we're sometimes plagued with an inner feeling that we're not succeeding, we're not good enough, or we feel guilty in some way. We sometimes use the term self-reproach. It might be we're trying to meet a standard set by our parents, perhaps expectations that are set by a leader. We don't feel good enough. We don't feel like we're achieving enough. We might feel that what we're doing isn't good enough. We might feel that our sin is too great, or I sin too often, or I can't beat a particular sin. We might feel I'll never be good enough for my boyfriend, my husband, my dad, my wife, my church. I'll never be good enough for myself, my God, for society. Deep down, many of us, in fact all of us, will be at some point in our lives weary or burdened by something. And that's because whatever we base our life on, we're striving. We generally do lack contentment. We do judge ourselves quite harshly at times, and we do all do things wrong. So if you're burdened by some of these things or other things, I suggest the rest that Jesus offers is on offer to you. It's on offer to me. It's on offer to us all. So we've looked at who is the rest on offer to. And secondly, we're going to ask, well, what is this rest like? I'm sorry if you're here today tired and you're hoping that Jesus is going to guarantee you rest from the physical or mental hardship you've been going through. It's not that he doesn't care about that. He cares about you. He loves you more than you can imagine. It's not that he can't grant you physical restoration. He made you and he sustains you and all living things on the planet. However, I think it would be wrong to read the passage and conclude that this is all that's on offer today. If you're thinking, Dan, that sounds a bit negative, the good news is that I think the rest that's being offered is far greater rest. In verse 29, we read, Jesus is offering rest for our souls. So what is this rest? And I think, as ever, when trying to define something, it can be helpful to define first what it is not. I don't think this is some kind of spiritual Zen-like experience whereby all our cares and toils and pains just float away and we're left in a state of calm and quiet. We don't come to Jesus for him to offer us some kind of self-help guidance or mindfulness or a pursuit, instructions for a pursuit of peace in some kind of perhaps Eastern philosophical or Buddhist sense of the word. And it's also important to note that the rest that Jesus offers doesn't mean that if we take his yoke, our life will be free from physical burdens or suffering or pain. We only need to look at countless examples in the Bible all around us of people and Christians who are suffering enormously. But if we've looked at what the rest isn't, we do need to answer the question, what is the rest? Well, let's just look again at what Jesus says. In verse 29, he says, "Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, what's a yoke? It's not an egg yolk. It's something you put on a beast of burden, an ox, a donkey, a horse who's carrying a burden, a working animal. The yoke isn't the burden itself, but it is connected to a burden. The two are intertwined. Elsewhere in the Bible, I'm not going to flash it up on screen, but if you want to make a note of it and look at it, if you look in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 1, Timothy speaks of servants being yoked to their master. In Jesus' time, Jewish disciples would be strongly connected and yoked to their religious leaders, to their teachers, their rabbis. So there is a sense that Jesus' yoke means, well, taking on Jesus' yoke means becoming his servant or his disciple. And we learn from him by listening to and being obedient to his commandments. Now, if that's the case, being yoked to someone or something might not sound very restful or liberating. In fact, it might sound like we're being bound or weighed down with more burdens or someone else's burdens. I don't know what you think, but I think generally our world says, if you want to have freedom, if you want to not be burdened, whatever you do, do not be tied to someone else. Do not follow someone else or do what they tell you to do. Be yourself. Do what you want to do. However, the critical thing to note here, like we said at the beginning, is that we all carry yokes. We're all yoked to someone or something, whether we like to accept it or not. We are actually all slaves to something or someone. We like to think of ourselves as independent and free, but in some capacity, we are all living for another person's approval, perhaps a philosophy, perhaps a job, perhaps an education, our money, our stocks and shares, our property portfolio, material security, a house, sex, power. So when Jesus says, take my yoke, our response shouldn't be, no, thank you, I don't want to take anyone else's yoke. I won't serve anyone or anybody. What Jesus is saying that whoever you are, you're already yoked and burdened. Whichever yoke you currently carry, there is a far better one. Jesus has an alternative yoke that he wants to offer you, and it's the best yoke, an easy yoke with a light burden. No other burden or thing or person that we live for will provide us with ultimate satisfaction, unconditional love, total forgiveness, even when we continually mess up, like Peter did in the story we read earlier, even when we fall short of standards or hurt that person. In taking Jesus' yoke, thus connecting ourselves to him, we're yoking ourselves to someone who promises to satisfy us, to forgive us, to love us, to teach us, to help us. Yes, there are commandments. Jesus does command us to be obedient, but the commandments are good for us. And crucially, his love for you, his love for us, is not dependent on us meeting his high standard. Besides the fact that we're imperfect sinners and he is perfect in God, Jesus also carries our burdens for us. He helps us with our burdens. I think it's really helpful to consider what Jesus says in verse 29. He says, I'm gentle and lowly in heart. We think back to the passage we looked at briefly earlier in Matthew 23 of the Pharisees imposing heavy burdens and requirements on the people. And you contrast that to the words of Jesus here. The Pharisees harshly imposed and lorded over the people. In contrast, Jesus says he is lowly in heart, humble. These are the qualities of a servant. And that's important because he serves us. When you are weighed down by sin, guilt, the expectations of others, the constant sense that you're not good enough, Jesus says to you, exchange your yoke, those people or things that you yoke yourself to. Exchange those for my yoke of unconditional love, of grace, of forgiveness, and I will give you rest for the soul. Some of us may have a sense that we're just not good enough for God. Perhaps that's putting you off perhaps that's put you off going to church before, or put you off from praying, or put you off from trusting in Jesus yourself. In one sense, it's really good that we're concerned about what God thinks of us. And there is great news for you today. If you're burdened by these types of thoughts, if you take Jesus' yoke, thus connecting yourself to him, when God looks at you, he doesn't see your sin, your failings, the mess you're making of your life. He doesn't judge you for that. Rather, he sees a precious, cherished, beloved child, redeemed to himself through Jesus, who holds you. If you're not a Christian, you may wonder why Christians talk and pray a lot about and sing a lot about the cross. And it's because it was at the cross where Jesus served us in perhaps the most significant way by taking all of our sin, all the wrong things we've done in the past, continue to do, will do in the future, and dealing with it once and for all. Because he was perfect. He was the perfect sacrifice for all that wrong. We'll still sin in this life, but by yoking ourselves to him and learning from him, Jesus helps us. And when we do sin, we don't need to be weighed down with the guilt of sin because he's forgiven us once and for all. So we've seen what the rest is like. But we need to ask, well, how do we get it? How do we get this rest? Well, put simply, we must come to Jesus. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, all you who labour and are heavy laden. Come to me." But what does that mean? What does it mean to come to Jesus? Well, firstly, if you think back to the passage that was read earlier, the first 4 verses, verses 20 to 24, 5 verses perhaps, in Matthew chapter 11, it's Jesus denouncing towns where he's been preaching, that he's visited and done amazing miracles, and yet they've not repented. They've not taken him, they've not accepted him for who he is. They've not accepted his claims to be one with the Father. So, in one sense of the word, in one sense, coming to Jesus means to take him for his word, to accept him for who he is. In verse 27 of Matthew 11, Jesus says, "All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." By coming to Jesus, he reveals God to us, because he is God. So in this context, come to me means believe Jesus, that he is who he says he is, one with the Father, that he is God. Accept his teaching. Repent, turn away from your sin and follow him. Secondly, in terms of what it means to come to Jesus, I think there's more here in the passage. In verse 25, Jesus says, "I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children." Now, when Jesus says little children, I think he's contrasting the wise and the learned. The wise and learned might sound positive, but it's those who trust in their own wisdom and knowledge. You might say they're even proud. Whereas in contrast, a little child is humble. They look up to adults. They're aware of their helplessness, their need for a parent's care. You think about a little child who's fallen over, who's done something wrong, like Mark was saying earlier. They're aware of their need for care and love when they stumble and fall. So in this context, how do we come to Jesus? Well, I think we need to accept our helplessness. We need to accept that we yoke ourselves to things that don't satisfy. We need to be humble. We need to accept that we do mess up. We need to ask Jesus to accept us and forgive us. We sometimes call this having faith in Jesus. And the great news is that if we do this, if we humbly put our trust in Jesus, he will certainly accept us, and he guarantees to provide rest for our souls. If you do this, you no longer need to worry about whether you're good enough for other people, whether you're succeeding in life, whether you're good enough for God, because you're yoked to Jesus. You're intertwined with God's Son, a beloved and cherished child of God. It's who you are now. You fall under the gracious and eternal love and forgiveness of God. Just got one final thought on this, which is that Jesus talks about rest for the soul. The soul is something that lives on beyond our physical death. Rest for the soul isn't just something for this life. It's an eternal blessing. Coming to Jesus, taking his yoke, his rest, has everlasting consequences for us. And it gives us confidence that whatever this life may hold for us, and it will hold hard times, trials, pain, illness, death, but we have a hope of the future, a future hope of wonderful rest in the presence of Jesus. For all those who've trusted in Jesus, it'll be a place where there are no more burdens, and a place where there is no more sin. We're going to close now, and as we close, we're just going to read together Or I'm going to read verses 28 to 30 from Matthew 11 again. Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.